Black Egypt and her Negro Pharaohs. My interest in writing this chapter was the finding of many things which I believe to be true, but I did not have enough evidence to support my claim. In my research, I became very much interested when I succeeded in finding and collecting enough data from some of the most outstanding historians and anthropologists, both ancient and modern, and also the history recorded on monuments, reliable evidence of facts on ancient Egyptian civilization and the race to which they belong. Millions of dollars have been spent in expeditions and explorations to find and unearth the marvelous wonders of the land of the pharaohs. But with a few exceptions, these scientists have failed to tell the racial background or the merits of the ancient Egyptian culture and the characteristics of its people. Many of these writers, both in school textbooks and general history, refer to the ancient Egyptians as a white race, more or less as Semitic stock, using the term which has become a slogan in all such histories, that the ancient Egyptians were not Negroes. In my reply to these authors' false statements, I will say frankly that the ancient Egyptians were not a Caucasian nor a Semitic race, but they were full-blooded Negroes and belonged to the same race of Negroes that you find in America and Africa today. The ancient Egyptians were black with woolly hair and thick lips, similar to what you would find in the colored race today. While I admit that in some of them, in the northern section of Egypt, the shades of complexion were somewhat brown in color, while on the other hand, those who lived in the southern parts of Egypt were darker because of the vertical rays of the sun. The varied complexions of the African nations up to the period of 700 BC was caused by the variation of climate and the high altitude of mountain chains rather than the admixture of race. The ancient Egyptians were not white nor yellow, and in this chapter, I take great pride to introduce them to the world as a nation of black men. There were no mixed breeds found among them until the later period of the empire. The ancient Egyptian empire was founded and built by black men who ruled and governed Egypt for 7,000 years without foreign interference, with exception of the time she was invaded by Hyksos and Ethiopia. But the two black nations were members of the same race. The Egyptians descended from the Ethiopians. Heron's Historical Research of African Nation, pages 313 and 14 says, Thebes, as well as the states in general of Upper Egypt, are called in the proper annals of the priest colonies from Meroe in Ethiopia, and at Thebes the service of Jupiter Ammon. This temple was the common center of the state. Gives itself a striking evidence of such was the case. Memphis, whose situation was so remarkable from dam and embankments, is called a colony of Thebes, Thebes. The other cities of Egypt likewise derived their descent directly or indirectly from Ethiopia, of which they considered themselves as colonies, and of which their religion and institution furnished abundant proof. From the body evidence, then, we come to the conclusion that the same race which ruled in Ethiopia and Meroe spread themselves as colonies in the first instance in Upper Egypt, that these later colonies, in consequence of their great prosperity in their turn, was the parent body of the other. The scientist Pritchard, in his Natural History of Man, page 153, says the true Negro conformation requires no comment, but the practical eye readily detects a few heads with decidedly mixed character in which those of the Negro predominates. For these I propose the name of the Negroid crania. For while osteological development is more or less that of the Negro, the hair is long but sometimes harsh, thus indicating the combination of features which is familiar in the mulatto of the present day. There remains other examples in which the Caucasian traits predominate, but it is partially blended with those of the Negro. The historian Pritchard, in the above paragraph, tried his best to make a Caucasian out of the ancient Egyptian. The more he tried to make him white, the blacker he turned. Pritchard begins his argument with the Egyptian being a Negro and ends where he begins, the Egyptian being a Negro. While I will admit that these found in Egypt, the mummies of kings that were not black Egyptians are what we call Negroes, but these mummies, if found, were the kings who ruled Egypt after the fall of Ethiopia and Egyptian pharaohs, because Egypt and Ethiopia were great empires of the black nation. Pritchard further said, pages 124 and 5, in their complexion and in many of their physical peculiarities, the Egyptians were an African race in the eastern and even in the central parts of Africa. We shall trace the existence of various groups in physical character nearly resembling the Egyptians, and it would be difficult to observe a gradual deviation among many African nations of their continent from the physical type of the Egyptians to the strongly marked character of the Negro without any very decided break or interruption. In the above paragraph, Pritchard shows plainly that these Egyptians were a Negro race, and the gradual change in the complexion of the African nation is due directly from the climatic influence, but they belong to the same stock. Rawlinson, in his History of Egypt, page 24, says, it is even conceivable that the Egyptians was produced by a gradual advance and amelioration from that of the Negro. The scientist Massey, in his book Egypt, the Light of the World, page 251, says, the dignity is so ancient that the insignia of the pharaohs evidently belonged to a time when the Egyptians were nothing but the girdle of the Negro. Captain Burton, an English explorer in 1883, wrote Massey, saying, you are quite right about the African origin of the Egyptian. I have sent home 100 skulls to prove it. The Greek Herodotus says the caucasian certainly appeared to be of Egyptian origin, which indeed, before I had conversed with any on the subject, I had always believed. But I was desirous of being satisfied. I interrogated the people of both countries, and the results were, it seemed that the Caucasian had better remembrance of the Egyptian than the Egyptian had of the Caucasian. That's capital Colchian. The Egyptians were of the opinion that the Caucasians were descended from the troops of Sesostris' army. To this I was also inclined, because they were black and their hair was short and curled. The scientist Volney says, the ancient Egyptians were real Negroes of the same species with all the natives of Africa, though, as it might be expected after mixture for many ages with the Greeks and Romans, they have lost the identity of their first color. Yet, they still remain strong marks of their first conformation. Brush Egypt under the Pharaohs, page 401, says, I have expressed the opinion that the Egyptian migrated from a permeable home in Asia. Yet this idea is opposed by another view by a method of historical data that the origin of the Egyptian people would have to be sought in the Negro Baraba, Africa. These are supposed to have ascended the upper Nile Valley from the south and to have cultivated it and created one of the few centuries of civilization in the ancient world, without losing or renouncing the peculiarities of their African custom. Their mingling with a Syro-Abrahamian nomad race who penetrated Egypt from the east and also with the Libyan from the west is supposed to have given origin to the Egyptian of today, in which the African blood predominates.